75 years ago, a game changer happened in Jewish history. On May 14th, 1948, the provisional government, or most of it, gathered in Tel Aviv and issued a declaration. It was a declaration of independence for the modern state of Israel. But just as the musical drama of 1776 dramatizes the ups and downs and machinations that went into the American Declaration of Independence, there is yet, as far as I know, a musical to be written about what went into making this one. But it was just as complicated and just as seeing the sausage made as any other kind of governmental process. They went back and forth on what would the name of the state be. Should they specify any borders based on the partition plan or their maximal aspirations or somewhere in between? Should they include any reference to God in the text? Some of the Orthodox delegates said, absolutely, we have to. And some of the communist delegates said, no way. As we'll see, they compromised even on that. But my favorite story about the signing of this Declaration of Independence was they were hammering it out late into the night before the day when the British mandate ended and an open space in the calendar began when the declaration could be issued. And so by the time it was done, they had typed up the text, but they had not had time to have the calligrapher make it fancy on the document they would sign. So the document that was actually signed at the ceremony was mostly blank. They knew what the text would be. But technically, they signed a blank check, not knowing exactly what would wind up there, but hoping it would be what they had agreed to. Well, that image of signing a blank document, not being sure what's going to happen, that's a marvelous image for the founding of the State of Israel. And they figured that this was just the first of a series of legal documents, including a full constitution that would come. They would get to it later. And later became, as they say in Latin America, mañana, which means never. My topic tonight is to talk about Israel in crisis. Now, I find that scheduling a topic of Israel in crisis, I can schedule any number of months in advance because there's always something going on that could qualify as Israel in crisis. But tonight we could ask, as I did at the beginning, which crisis? We have 75 years of Israeli history. Tonight I'm going to talk about 7.5 crises. You'll see the half crisis actually is maybe bigger than all the others put together. But to understand these issues, what we're going to do is actually go back to that Declaration of Independence, and you can actually see what that scroll looked like. This is sideways to fit, but they signed the bottom and they hadn't yet filled in all the top. And that's what they signed. But this is actually given a Hebrew name in Israeli life. It's not just the Declaration of Independence, it's the Megillat HaAtzmaut, the scroll of independence. Drawing just like the Megillah for Purim that we'll be celebrating next week. It's a scroll, but it's a particularly important scroll. Some have even begun to observe Israeli Independence Day by reading this document in a ritual fashion as a way of creating a new ritual to celebrate this new momentous moment in Jewish life. But to understand these crises, we're going to use the text of this declaration as an early vision of the state that we can then compare to how it turned out today. Just as we saw that passage from Theodor Herzl in our service, that today strikes us as sadly naive and idealistic. It motivated people, but it didn't come true. Well, we'll see how we evaluate that scroll of independence. But we'll start with a picture of the big vision. This is one paragraph that's often drawn on in many of the protests and activities that are going on today. Many of the crises impinge on this big idea paragraph. The state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and for the ingathering of the exiles. It will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will safeguard the holy places of all religions, and it will be faithful to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Sounds great. Actually includes some areas of rights that the United States Constitution and its Bill of Rights left out. For example, equality on the basis of sex. That was something that we still don't have guaranteed in our Constitution. It sounds egalitarian, universal, Jewish-focused, but not exclusive and not chauvinist. Well, we'll see how much of this big vision is still active in Israel today. Now, the reality that we're comparing this vision to, the most immediate reality, is the results of the most recent election in Israel in November of 2022, just a few months ago. It was the 5th election in 4 years. So since 2019, we've had 5 elections. It's about 10, 11 months, give or take. Now, a quick summary of the results. The Netanyahu coalition got 64 seats, but it's the most religious and right-wing government that Israel has ever formed out of its coalitions, because the Overton window, so to speak, has shifted to that side. It was also a disastrous election for the Israeli left. The Labor Party went down from its previous 7 seats to only 4 seats, the bare minimum for party representation. And the Meretz Party, which is the even further to the left party from the Labor Party in favor of both civil rights and peace negotiations, the Meretz Party didn't make a deal to share excess votes with the Labor Party, so they went from 6 seats to 0 seats. They didn't even pass the threshold to get into the Knesset. And they missed it by less than 30,000 votes out of 4.7 million cast total. So it was a disastrous calculation leading to a disastrous result, because if you had even 4 seats for Meretz, there would have been fewer seats for that right-wing coalition. So what are our 7 crises we have to face today? Well, the number one crisis on the popular mind in Israel is not even what's happening with the Palestinians. It's what's happening or proposed to happen with the judiciary. This proposed series of judiciary and legal reforms that the coalition has presented. Let me give you a quick summary of those. Again, it's way more complicated, but we want to get an understanding of why hundreds of thousands of people have gone out into the streets week after week, day after day. Well, the number one thing they're trying to change is how justices are appointed to high courts in Israel. And my understanding is that it's actually a non-democratic procedure. What happens is retired Supreme Court justices and other judges form a panel, and they choose who should be the next judges. Doesn't consult with the Knesset, the parliament, at all. So perhaps there is some ground for improvement in that, because what that does is, of course, it produces judges who pick judges like they were. And then the next round of judges are picked by the people who were there before, and it winds up being very white, very Ashkenazi, very liberal, but also very establishment. And so this is one of those cases where sometimes there is a legitimate cause behind it. But it goes much further than how the court is appointed. It also has to do with what the court is allowed to look at, the whole issue of what's up and eligible for judicial review. We've seen machinations with this in our country as well, where laws are passed where private citizens get to enforce the law, and therefore the Supreme Court can't review it. That's the attempt. Well, the same kind of maneuvering is going on in Israel, where they're trying to ban the High Court from reviewing, for example, who is eligible to serve in the Israeli cabinet. One of the ministers who was the leader of a party, part of the coalition, is a man named Aryeh Deri. You may have heard of him or may not have. He was actually arrested for corruption and put in prison for corruption and bribery from his previous stint as a minister in the government. When he went to prison, part of his condition of his plea agreement was he would not go back into politics. Well, guess what? He's back in politics, he's back at the head of his party, and he's back in the cabinet again, being made the justice minister. Or minister of finance even, I think they proposed for him. Perfect place to get someone who took bribes before, right? Well, it turns out the Attorney General said, no, you can't serve there, and the Supreme Court upheld that decision. Well, so they decided to say, no, the judicial establishment, the legal establishment cannot decide who sits in the cabinet. It's only a political decision, none of your business. Well, it's again taking it off the judiciary's plate. Now, part of the problem with that issue is it's not clear in Israeli law who does get to make that decision of disqualifying someone. It's one of these ambiguities that when you don't have a constitution and you have a series of basic laws and other laws passed by Knesset that contradict other laws passed by previous Knesset, it simply is ambiguous, and there's an empty space that needs to be filled by something. And of course, the most important issue for Benjamin Netanyahu is who gets to decide if the prime minister is fit for office or not. As you may know, Netanyahu has been under investigation and now under indictment for corruption, for taking bribes from media moguls in order to get favorable treatment, more or less, making deals under the table, sometimes with cigars under the table or scotch under the table. Well, he doesn't want the Attorney General or the Supreme Court to be able to say that once he's indicted or once he's in prison, he's no longer fit to be prime minister. And so they're trying to take that off the Supreme Court table too. But the most challenging, the most inflammatory statement that they've made is to change the process of judicial review. Judicial review means that the Supreme Court can decide if the Knesset has gone too far. If they've passed a basic law that undermines the Declaration of Independence, that is illegal under international law, they want to take this off the table. Now, they're going to allow it, but if the Parliament wants to override the Supreme Court decision, all they would need is 61 votes. Guess how many votes you need to have a majority government? 61. So any government could override a Supreme Court decision. Now, having an override, again, is not necessarily a deal breaker if you do it right. After all, we have a system of check and balance in our constitutional system where if the president vetoes something, Congress can override it. They just need a supermajority of 2/3 of both houses, and then they can supersede the executive veto. So I can imagine a scenario where the Supreme Court issues a decision and you can get 2/3 of the Knesset or 3/4 of the Knesset or 80% of the Knesset. If you could get that, that's a very strong majority of representing the population, including people outside the government would have to support it. So I can imagine a circumstance where some kind of judicial review and overturning of that might be possible, but that's not what's happening here. So with all of these put together, the appointments to the court, the judicial review of who's allowed to be in the cabinet or who's allowed to be prime minister, and the very fact that you can simply override a Supreme Court decision with a majority, a simple majority, in the one house of legislature, that's too much. And so people have been protesting on the streets for weeks. They've been protesting in every major city. They've been protesting in smaller cities. There have been mass gatherings in the major cities, up to 100,000 people or more at major events. I think one day of protest had 300,000 people. They did a day of disruption this past Wednesday. And it's gone from the sublime to the ridiculous. The protests on Wednesdays finally ended late at night with Sarah Netanyahu, Benjamin's wife, besieged in a hair salon in Tel Aviv, where there were dozens of protesters outside the hair salon saying, she's getting her hair done when the world is burning down. And the police had to show up in force with horses and guards and everything to get her out. Now, I read an article just yesterday that speculates that maybe that was a setup. You know, maybe she went to a hairdresser exactly in Tel Aviv where all the protesters were, and then was pictured there, and spread around on WhatsApp and social media so everybody would know she was there. And then the protesters were not going into the store. They could have taken her out the back, but they had to send in all the, police on fire, horseback police to clear the square, and maybe it was dramatic. And then at the same time she was in that position, Netanyahu was standing on the floor of the Knesset saying, the protesters in Tel Aviv who are besieging my wife in the hair salon are as bad as the settlers who rampaged through that village in Palestine. He didn't use the word Palestine, but you know what I mean. Well, was it theater? It certainly was the comedy of the absurd. We've even had people who are so concerned about what this lack of judicial review could lead to, because of course if you don't have the courts, what's to hold back the most extreme impulses? We've had marches of women dressed in costume from The Handmaid's Tale. We've had reservists threatening to not serve in the army because they won't serve a dictatorship. It is definitely one of the largest mass protests and crisis of governmental system that Israel has ever seen. That's only crisis number one. Crisis number two is the issue of the rule of law in general. I see we have a couple of chat messages. Okay. A couple of chat messages from our memorial, and thank you for sharing those. The next crisis, the rule of law. Now, in the Declaration of Independence, it's very clear that the people writing it valued law and legal systems. They highlight the fact, for example, that the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution calling for the establishment of a Jewish state in this territory. They were required to take steps to do this, and this recognition of the right of the Jewish people by the UN is irrevocable. We have a right based on a legal decision that was made by a body of international law. So it's claiming that law defines why we are able to have a state. They have other rationales too, earlier in the document, but this is a very important one. And when they envision creating their state, notice right after the declaration, they say that from the moment of the end of the mandate tonight, until the establishment of elected regular authorities of the state in accordance with the Constitution, which will be adopted by the elected Constituent Assembly no later than the 1st of October, 1948. So they've got a timeline, they've got a plan for constitutional convention that will write a constitution, that will define how elections run. But for now, the People's Council will act as a provisional council of the state, and its executive organ, the People's Administration, will be the provisional government of the Jewish state, which will be called Israel. But they wanted a legal system, and they're describing a system based on regular elections that would then establish a constitution under which you could create a whole body of case law and define a legal system. But as we know, that constitution never came together. And the rule of law now has become a major crisis at almost every level of government in Israel. When the earthquake hit Turkey recently, I saw a piece saying that Israel, if it ever gets hit with an earthquake, is going to have similar issues of building code violations and, bakshish and ways of getting around what needs to be done. We already had a case of a dance hall some years ago that collapsed in the middle of, I think it was a bar mitzvah or a wedding celebration. It's only going to be worse in Israel because that level of corruption is there as well. But of course, the bribery case involving the prime minister is appalling. There is precedent for this. About 10 years ago, the president of the country, Moshe Katsav, was sentenced to prison for sexual assault. And that happened. So there is an attempt to impose a rule of law, but there's also people thinking they can get away with anything. Right now, the minister in charge of the police is a man named Ben Gvir. Ben Gvir was not allowed to join the army because they felt he was too radical, that he was too much a follower of Meir Kahane and couldn't treat everybody equally and would do violence to Arabs of any kind, citizens of Israel or otherwise. And so they didn't even allow him to serve in the army. He's in charge of the police now. They've even recently proposed, this was in one of the more recent cabinet meetings, that they should impose a death penalty for terrorists. You can rest assured, though, that it won't apply to any of the people who rampaged in the Palestinian village, because that's not terrorism. Maybe vigilantism, but Jewish terrorists, for the government currently in power, that's impossible. That's a contradiction in terms. And even some of the religious parties in the coalition are not so sure about that rule. Israel has a very, very ambivalent perspective on the death penalty. You may recall that when Adolf Eichmann was arrested in 1962, or arrested, he was kidnapped out of Argentina and taken to Israel in 1962. They had to pass a law to be able to kill him, because they had no provision for the death penalty in Israeli law. They finally passed one for crimes against humanity. For that we can kill you, so in this case, they hung him. But there's a strong sentiment against the death penalty, even going back into Jewish law and tradition. There's a passage in the Babylonian Talmud in Tractate Makot that says that a court that puts one person to death in 7 years is a destructive court. And other rabbis say, no, if you put one person to death in 70 years, it's a destructive court. There's a real ambivalence about that finality, and they want to find ways around it, even for what would be capital cases according to Torah law. And so the religious parties in the government are saying, well, this death penalty for terrorists thing, what about our tradition of not liking the death penalty? Well, that might be a point of fracture in the coalition. That's crisis number 2. Crisis number 3 is the separation of religion and government. Now, people who don't know much about Israel imagine that it's run by rabbis. In fact, Hamas, which wants the world to be run by Muslim clerics, imams, imagines that Israel is run by the rabbis. And super progressive leftists, who are very secular, imagine that Israel is run by the rabbis, but that's not true either. You see, Israel was founded by secular Jews, and you can tell from the way they wrote the Declaration of Independence. I love this line in the very first paragraph. Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here their identity was shaped. Here they first attained to statehood, created cultural values of national and universal significance, and gave to the world the eternal book of books. In other words, according to this declaration, who wrote the Bible? Not God. The Jewish people. We created it. If you want a more secular statement of Jewish culture, this is it. And I mentioned the compromise when they wanted to include God in the document in some way. Well, finally, Ben-Gurion said, okay, let's include a reference to the rock of Israel. And for religious people, that'll mean God. And for secular people, that'll mean the rocks of it, like the land of Israel, the rock that is this country. And it was good enough. The communists signed it, the religious parties signed it, it made it through. But they couldn't even say God in the document, which, by the way, is different from our Declaration of Independence, which talks about rights being endowed by a creator, and our Constitution, which mentions in the year of our Lord at the end where they sign it. So this is even more secular than the US founding documents. They clearly had a vision of separating the two. In fact, there's a passage in Theodor Herzl's The Jewish State where he says, our clergy will live in their temples just like the soldiers go back to their barracks. We respect them, we use them when we need them, and then tell them, thank you very much, bye-bye. Well, as we know, that isn't how Israel has turned out. What they're talking about now is a big change from this. Remember that big vision? Freedom, justice, and peace as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. Well, one problem is, I don't know if you've read the prophets in the Bible. They're not always so nice. They're not interested in religious pluralism. In fact, they condemn the Israelites that worship other gods or are not worshiping in the right way. They also talk about doing justice and peace, but they also talk about the religious stuff, and that's part of the prophetic legacy too. You want to ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all inhabitants, irrespective of religion? Well, then you don't let the Orthodox rabbinate control who gets to get married, and who's allowed to be buried in Jewish cemeteries, and who's allowed to count as a Jew for the population registry, but that's what they did. They inherited the Turkish system of the millet, where your status is defined by your religious community, and left it in place. Again, they didn't write the Constitution, they didn't fix it, they just carried it forward. There are even laws from the British Mandate period that are still legally in effect in Israel today, almost, 75 plus years later. Well, what have they done now? They're proposing, as part of their judicial review, to make rabbinic courts a mediation option for non-personal status issues. Now, for right now, if you want to get divorced in Israel, you have to go to the rabbinic courts, and you have to go through their process. And that can often lead to problems, and women in particular are often treated not fairly in these rabbinic courts. But you don't have to go there if you have a beef with your employer. You don't have to go there if you have a property dispute with your neighbor. Now, in 1 or 2 states, and I think in the 1 or 2 provinces in Canada, you're allowed to use rabbinic courts as mediation, as an alternate court, another way to get a legal resolution. But both parties have to agree to it. Well, they're trying to do that in Israel now, to make this eligible for mediation with both parties agreeing. But if you live in an ultra-Orthodox community, and this is an option for resolving property disputes, and one of the parties says, I want to go to the rabbinic court, do you think you can get away with saying no? I don't think so. If you're employed in an ultra-Orthodox or even a modern Orthodox establishment, and the employer says, we have to take this employment dispute to the rabbinic court, do Do you think you'll be able to say, no, I insist on the secular court? Especially if you yourself are part of that same religious community? It's just going to be problematic. And the treatment of women in those courts is why they dressed up in the Handmaid's Tale outfits, because they're afraid that this is the direction it's going to go. They're also talking about funding religious schools without requiring some basic skills in human literacy today, in math, in civics, in history. We have these same arguments in the United States, of course. If you saw that New York Times expose about all those schools in New York receiving money and refusing to teach the basic requirements that non-public schools have to cover according to the New York State Board of Education. Well, it's the same problem in Israel, but now it's made even worse because the previous government was going to put in some civics requirements. And I have to tell you, having followed this issue for many years, in part from people who've left these ultra-Orthodox communities and have realized how insufficient their education was, and also supporting an organization that advocates for those families, there are many people in those communities who want them to teach math, who want them to teach civics and science and history. They want their children to learn what's happening in the world and to get job skills. But they can't go against the community. And so at least having an outside government do it would get that in there for those people who want it. And for those people who don't, their kids need to learn, because denying your children an education is a violation of your children's rights to know. You see, the problem with religious fundamentalism in Israel and the separation of religion and government is, in this whole document of the Declaration of Independence, it never quite defines what it means by a Jewish state. It says, establishing a Jewish state, we establish this Jewish state, but it doesn't say, what does it mean by Jewish? Is it Jewish by ethnicity? Jewish by culture and calendar? Jewish by religion? Well, again, they didn't want to clarify because they had to meet the needs of many, and in the end, the ambiguity has created part of the problem we deal with today. Speaking of which, our next crisis is the issue of Jewish pluralism, the idea that maybe there's more than one way to be Jewish. After all, the state was founded by secular Jews, many of whom had come out of Orthodoxy or had grandparents who did. There wasn't really a tradition of liberal Judaism like Reform or conservative Judaism there, and even today, there are very small communities in Israel proper. But there were always varieties of ways to do Jewish. They just did them totally separately. But because they were substantially Jews and Jews marrying Jews, it didn't really matter. And the Declaration affirms the value of including all Jews in this project. It describes as part of the rationale for establishing the state in the first part that this Jewish state would open the gates of the homeland wide to every Jew and confer upon the Jewish people the status of a fully privileged member of the comity of nations. And an early clerical decision by a minister of the Interior, which produced a controversy, he said, anybody who says they're Jewish, let them in. He was willing to accept self-definition, as we do in our movement even today. That was part of that secular Jewish tradition of, if you're crazy enough to want to be Jewish, then welcome. But the religious parties couldn't handle it. And so ultimately, by 1970, the law of return had been defined to limit it to the grandchild of a Jew for the purpose of getting into the country. But to be registered as Jewish, it had to be Orthodox definition or Orthodox conversion. As they founded the state, though, they appealed to the Jewish people throughout the diaspora to rally round the Jews of the land of Israel in the task of immigration and upbuilding the state. Help us. We need you. We want you. Remember that old slogan, "We are one"? That was the mission. Well, the problem is that the values of Jews in Israel disagree with each other, and the values of Jews in Israel disagree with Jews outside of Israel. As one example, there have been great strides made for LGBTQ acceptance in Israel. Israel was far ahead of the US in allowing gays to serve in the military, for example. Gay adoption also is something that has, again, gone through the Supreme Court. There are pride parades, and the Tel Aviv Pride Parade is one of the biggest pride parades in the world. And there's even one in Jerusalem. Even though it has been attacked from time to time and had counter-protesters, nevertheless, there's still a pride parade in the heart of Jerusalem. But one of the ministers who joined the coalition from the Noam party, his name was Noam, he was from a different party. I can't remember the name off the top of my head. He said, in describing himself, that he was a proud homophobe. That was a phrase that he used. He was put in charge of the Jewish identity piece of the school project. And so people were worried, what is he going to do here? You know, is this another Don't Say Gay challenge for this community? He even wanted to change the forms that people filled out so it didn't say parent 1 and parent 2. It had to say father and mother. Now, fortunately, sometimes bureaucracy works in your favor. The bureaucrats refused to make the change. Ultimately, he's quit the ministry. He's still in the coalition, but he gave up fighting against the bureaucracy. So if you've ever had to deal with Israeli bureaucracy, it's terrible, but the fact that it drags its heels sometimes is a good thing. But you have controversy again over who's allowed to pray at the Western Wall and in what context and with what religious paraphernalia, clothing, and Torah scrolls and everything else. You have terrible relations with non-Orthodox Judaisms who are motivated to protest, even in diaspora, over what's happening in Israel, in part over the judiciary issues, but also because they fear that their status in the law of return or in other areas is going to be undermined. And this would change the relationship between Israel and the diaspora. We are one, well, maybe we are two. Now, settling people on the land was a core mission of the Zionist movement. In describing their history, their justification for declaring a state, it highlights the fact that Jews strove in every generation to reestablish themselves in their ancient homeland. And in recent decades, they came in great numbers. They built villages and towns. They created a thriving community, controlling its own economy and culture, loving peace but knowing how to defend itself, bringing the blessings of progress to all the country's inhabitants. I sort of cringe even saying that phrase. It's like Jewish white man's burden. And aspiring toward independent nationhood. This was the building the land. Not just if you build it, they will come. But if you build it, it will build you, and it will make the state a reality, facts on the ground. Well, the settlers in the West Bank point to this passage in the Declaration of Independence and just say, we're doing the same thing. We're just the new settlers of the land. Now, whether they have legal title to the land on which they're building their houses, well, maybe that's secondary. Are they displacing people who actually own the land? Well, it doesn't matter. You see, this settlement of the land was seen as a positive value in the founding of the state because it's how the state was founded and built and established. But now, what to do with these territories? The occupied West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, to use that phrasing, we never defined what the land is. What are the borders? What are rightful claims? When the Balfour Declaration was issued in 1917, they were very clearly ambiguous. You could tell diplomats wrote it. The original wording said, His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment of Palestine as the national Jewish home. But the final wording said, we view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national Jewish home. So instead of the entire territory only going to the Jewish national home, now part of the territory can go to a Jewish national home. Don't forget, it was the British who also promised the land to King Faisal and Lawrence of Arabia, in the Arab Revolt, and also promised to divide it among the French for areas of influence in the Sykes-Picot Treaty. Well, that's what diplomats do, right? They promise something to everybody. But in this case, the Balfour Declaration was a promise of some land, but what land was it? And in the 1920s, they fulfilled their promise to Faisal by carving out a good chunk of Palestine, what had been Palestine, and making it something else. It's now called Jordan. It used to be called Transjordan, which meant across the Jordan from the land of Canaan, Israel, Palestine, whatever you called it. But it was part of the Palestine territory under the Ottoman Empire. And in fact, for a long time, the right-wing ancestors of the Likud party, at the time called the Cherut party, had a logo. It had a hand holding a gun superimposed on a map of the old map of Israel proper and Greater Israel, including Jordan itself. And their slogan at the top was, Rak Kach, only thus, with a hand and a gun and all the land. That's been the ideology of that revisionist right-wing Jewish strain in Zionism all these years. The Labor Party and the founders of the state were willing to accept the partition, but they didn't want to tie their hands. They said, well, what if we actually win some territory in this war that's already started? Well, let's not define it exactly. But they accepted an armistice in 1949 at what was called the Green Line. It still exists on a map, if not in reality. And they were willing to accept that as Israel from 49 until 67. But after 67, with the tremendous victories in the Six-Day War, it was just too tempting to give it all back. So even Labor Party officials and governments put settlements in place in the West Bank, along the Jordan Valley, and in other strategic places. It is not only the right wing that helped to create the settlement enterprise. It was the left wing too. So what's happening now in the government? Well, you have the most radical of settlers represented in government. In fact, the person in charge of the settlements is Bezalel Smotrich, who himself lives in a settlement and is in favor of radical maneuvers. He's one of the people, by the way, who cheered on this riot in Hawara. In fact, he, at a conference, said, I wish Hawara would be wiped off the map. I just wish the Israeli army would do it, instead of private citizens. That's quoted in public in a conference with video. So our State Department said, that's disgusting and terrible. But he's still the finance minister, and he's coming to the US to speak to the Israel Bonds Conference later this month. It's gotten so bad that a conference was convened in Aqaba in Jordan to get the Palestinians and the Israeli government and the Jordanians and the Americans together to talk about how can we settle things down. And they came out of that meeting saying, okay, well, we'll put a pause on some of the settlement development. Within 12 hours of that statement being issued, the joint statement out of the diplomatic meetings, Netanyahu said, no way, we're not stopping any settlements. Smotrich said, no way, we're never stopping any settlements. The government doesn't even know what the other part of the government is saying. They won't accept any delay, any pause, any retrenchment, let alone giving up territory, let alone the compromise of land for peace. That's crisis number 5. I've still got 2.5 more. Now, crisis number 6 is the issue of Palestinian resistance and violence. Remember that line, we will develop the land for the benefit of its inhabitants, right? We're bringing the blessings of progress to the benefit of the inhabitants. Well, yes, right, on the screen. The blessings of progress to all the country's inhabitants. Sometimes the country's inhabitants have their own opinions about what progress they'd like to see. Now, we know that there were tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees created by the founding of the State of Israel. We know they were not allowed to return because the demographic balance of the original partition line was 60-40 Jewish to Arab, and after all the population maneuvers and people coming in from the displaced persons camps and from Yemen, now the numbers were 80-20, which is where they still are today in Israel proper. And that was a much more stable demographic balance from the perspective of the Israeli establishment. And so they were happy to leave it at 80-20. Plus there were also tens of thousands of Jewish refugees from Iraq and later from Syria and from Libya and North Africa, Morocco, Tunisia, that wound up in Israel as well. And having some empty apartment buildings was actually kind of helpful. So they settled in place of the Palestinians who had been there. And the Palestinians who longed to return wound up staying in refugee camps now for 2 and going on 3 generations. They also weren't resettled by the Arab countries in which they lived because they wanted to go home and those countries wanted them to go home too. After 1967, it got much worse because now you have these large territories in Gaza and in the West Bank that Israel is in control of with large masses of Palestinians. There are millions of Palestinians. In fact, between the river and the sea, to use that geographic designation from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, there may be equal numbers of Palestinians and Jews, or at most the Jews are up by 1 million, like 6 to 5 million, something like that. And of course there's Palestinian refugees scattered even further out. If they came home, it might be parity. And so that's why the idea of a one-state solution terrifies the Israeli establishment. Because if they don't have a demographic majority, what's to stop the votes from changing the flag and changing the anthem? You might have heard when we sang Hatikva earlier tonight, it talked about a Jewish heart that longs for Zion. What kind of an anthem is it for those 20% of Israeli citizens that are Arab, Palestinian, who have to sing, if they're singing the anthem, about a Jewish heart longing for Zion? What's going to happen if you try to make one state out of both of these populations, looking at the full population between the river and the sea. Now, there's been a two-state solution proposed for the last 30 years. And there have been progress in a few areas, but there's been a lot of backsliding in many more. And we know that the situation of the Arabs living in the West Bank and the Jews living in the West Bank are radically different. The Jews have special access roads, they have preferred water rights, they have special security that protects them, even as they're doing bad things to Palestinians. There's a lot of vigilante violence that's conducted against these Palestinians. The negotiations are going nowhere, and more facts on the ground, more illegal settlements on hilltops are developing. And to be honest, the Palestinian Authority has become a joke. Its last election was over 15 years ago, and it was supposed to be a 4-year term, and some disconnect there between a 4-year term and elections 15 years ago. It didn't even protect its own citizens when these settlers were rampaging. What about the Palestinian police? Where are they? They weren't. Now, they do intervene to crack down on their own civil society when people try to complain about the corruption of the Palestinian Authority. Then the Palestinian police will show up. There's a piece just this week in Haaretz, an Israeli paper, talking about that dynamic. One of the reasons, though, that Ben Gvir and his Jewish Strength Party, Osma Yehudit, was elected with so many seats was that he ran on a platform. I'm tough on the Arabs. I'm tough on Arab crime, after there were serious Arab-Jewish riots in Israel in 2021. In the city of Lod in particular, there were violence in both directions. Arabs attacking Jewish stores and homes and cars, and the other direction as well. So Palestinian resistance is sometimes nonviolent and sometimes violent. After all, what sparked the pogrom against Arabs in Hawara was the shooting of 2 yeshiva students, and another one was shot the day after in Jericho. And so there is still violence being done against Israelis in the West Bank and in Israel proper, with car rammings that kill children and all kinds of terrible things. But that's crisis number 6. Number 7, in the end, is what happens to these settlers in response. Now, this is talking about the Palestinians, where they were promised the basis of full and equal citizenship and due representation. Now, this is to the Palestinian citizens, but of course, if you make it one state, they'd have to get citizenship too. And while promising cooperation with those beyond the territory, that hand was never extended back to them until recently with the Abraham Accords. We really haven't seen the full promise of Israel cooperating with the Middle East. So what have the settlers done? The model of the Declaration of Independence was that the people longed for the land. They hoped and prayed to return for the land, and they wanted to restore their political freedom. Lihyot am chofshi be'artzinu, to be a free people in our land, sings Hatikva. But that isn't the rationale that the settlers use. They use something that is not in the Megillat HaAtzmaut, the scroll of the independence. They use instead what is found in the Megillat HaTorah, in the scroll of a Torah. In Genesis 15, God makes a covenant with Abraham, and he says, "To your offsprings I assign this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. All these peoples, all their land is yours." Who needs a Declaration of Independence? Who needs the United Nations? Who needs the deed of title to a land? This is my deed. I can post this on the door. God gave it to us. He took it away from them and gave it to us. This is the rationale for some of the settlers. Now, some of them are living there for quality of life and for cheaper housing, and there's other reasons people move into these territories. But the hard edge, the ones that are the most radical, setting up these hilltop settlements, rampaging through Palestinian olive groves and cities. This thing in Hawara was just a question of scale. These price tag burnings of cars and graffiti and destruction of homes and cutting down of olive trees, this happens all the time. It just doesn't get the attention that this scaled at this time. So the settlers are lawless out there because they're not following the law of the Declaration of Independence or of the courts or even of the Israeli military police. They're following the law of Genesis. God gave it to us, it's ours, get out of our way. Well, those are our 7 crises. But there's another half crisis. And it's only a half crisis, and we'll finish with this, not because it's not serious, it is serious, but because it's undefined, and we don't know which way it's going to go. The half crisis is, will Israel hang together at all? Or will it split and fall apart into 2, 3, 4, who knows what? Remember, the American Constitution was ratified in 1789. 75 years after 1789 puts us at 1864, the middle of the American Civil War, when the country fell apart and was put back together through violence. Now, with all of these crises, I have to ask one last question, and that is, why, oh why am I leading a trip to Israel in December? Am I looking for an interesting, exciting trip? Well, I'll tell you why we're taking this trip. One of the reasons has to do with the song we heard just before this talk, that beautiful song about a beautiful place, the Yam Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee. That's one of the stops on the tour, and it is indeed a beautiful place. But we want to find out what's really going on. Not just to read the pretty stories or the newspaper accounts for that matter. Let's see the facts on the ground. Reality matters. And in Humanistic Judaism, we try to find out the facts, even if they're uncomfortable. Now, we also need to go there to support the people who are fighting the good fight. There are some diaspora protests, and that's been articulating a voice. But the people on the ground there that are dressing up in those outfits, that are marching in those streets, that are taking time off of their work to advocate for what they believe in, they deserve and they need our support. They've asked for our support. There was even an article signed recently by a man named Daniel Gordis, who has made a career out of saying, "Diaspora Jews, shut up and leave us alone." And he said, "Diaspora Jews, speak up. We need you now." We will also have the chance, while we're there, to celebrate the 20th anniversary of training secular rabbis with our partner Tumurah in Israel. And that's a real milestone. 20 years since I first came to talk with Kol Hadash, and 20 years since they started the process of training leaders for these secular Jews. They need leadership. And that old leadership that founded the state is long gone. And so maybe new models are needed, and the secular rabbinate is one of them. We've helped to give it birth. And most importantly, we get to experience the possibilities of a Jewish state. Has it gone astray from its founding vision? Absolutely. But are there still possibilities? Are there still some of the positives of living a national Jewish culture? Well, we'll have a chance to experience it at the best possible time, during Hanukkah Christmas season. Because if you want to know what it's like to live as the majority, go someplace where you never hear Christmas carols again. No green and red, no trees, no Santa, unless you go to Bethlehem or the Christian quarter of the old city. That's where you find it. But everywhere else, it's menorahs and dreidels and sufganiyot and latkes and Hanukkah all the time. I felt a little weird. I almost wanted to sing a Christmas carol once in a while, just because I missed it. But it's a fantastic experience of what it's like to live there. Remember the poem we read in our service called Tourists? We want to see both. We want to see the arch from the Roman period, and we want to meet the person with the baskets of food who's trying to live a life in this land. It's a real place with real people, and we get to meet them. Well, I want to leave you with a couple of signs of hope, because there are some. After all, these protests have drawn tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people into the street to do something, and those people will vote. And it's drawn from many sectors of society. Many of them are appalled at the proposed excesses of the government moves and at the rampages that these settlers have gone on. Even religious Zionists, even Haredi ultra-Orthodox Jews, they've said this is a step too far and something needs to change. I hate to suggest it, but it might be that the best possible outcome from now is another election. It might even happen before December. If we're on schedule, one a year, well, we could get one in October, November, and guess what we get to see when we go this year in Jerusalem? What's next?